When I was about 15 or 16, for the usual rationalist reasons, I stopped believing. At that time, under the impression that belief and faith were the same thing. I since understand that they are not the same thing. But I thought they were, and I stopped believing in all this stuff. And I felt tremendously liberated. And only somewhat later, only years later, did it come to me that half of my head was missing, that I had just cut myself off from a tremendously important part of myself that was no longer available. I was doing a story on scientific enterprise that works out of Fort Pierce, Florida. They have a submersible that's capable of going to enormous depths, and it's totally dark, except for the biophosphorescent creatures that live there, tritones and cetopods and creatures like this. You feel like you're in the ocean at the dawn of creation. What it made me think of was when God confronts Job. God asks him, "Can you draw Leviathan with a hook? Who made Behemoth? Have you seen the springs of the ocean?" And I thought, God, I'm seeing the springs of the ocean. And I thought, this creature has as much life, is as perfectly formed, is as complete in its destiny, in its place in things, as I am. And it made me think, surely there is a providence underlying all these wonders. And that tempted me to faith.
To the Pope, the science and the wonder it evokes in us is not an obstacle to belief, but a privileged path to it. John Paul II urges us to look beyond our intellectual atheism, because reason, which limits man to the visible world, will kill faith.
When I was 15, the nun who was teaching me unwisely decided to teach me the rational proofs for the existence of God. I wasn't convinced. I thought they were fairly easily refuted. And then I went to university, and in those days you knew if you went to university you would lose two things, your virginity and your faith. And I lost them both. And however, I mean, the important thing here is that I was also imbued in the culture of the church. I had been singing great choral music ever since I was about 12. And I loved the Mass, and I loved the liturgy, and I loved the liturgical year. And I am greatly attached to them still. When I was in St. Petersburg, it was kind of a date with destiny. The huge bass bell, this baritone bell, spoke, and it was just amazing sound, and I thought, yes, it's the beginning of Mass, and I flew in the door, and the choir was singing the processional for the introit. The physicality of the sound strikes you on the face like velvet hammers. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I just sort of stretched my throat and just stood there, paralyzed. I couldn't move. And the choir sang the full diapason of the human voice. From the darkest bass tones to really floating high sopranos. It sounded to me like the craving of the human spirit for God and the total desolation that God is not palpable. To me, even worse, because God is not there. I mean, how amazing to listen to this extraordinary cry was greater than grand opera. I mean, it was more imbued with feeling than any Wagner I've ever heard in my life. It was astonishing. And I just stood there for an hour and a half. They never stopped singing. And by the time it was over, I kind of reeled back out. And all the front of my clothing was sodden. I'd actually been weeping the whole time, but I'd never known I was doing it. It was just, the tears had just been dripping off my chin. I sort of go, thinking, well, and of course I hadn't got a handkerchief. I hadn't expected, I didn't even believe I'd hear the Mass. And it never occurred to me that it would be like this.
Our yearning for God in whatever form, in the ocean or in the swell of music, suggests that we already have more faith than we know. But the ache is only a first step. But would ask us to open ourselves to a more wrenching experience.
John Paul II tells us, no, through suffering, you can become better and you can help others. It is, for Christians, it is the meaning of the cross. He feels that without suffering, one doesn't grow. An easy life without any kind of suffering practically has no depth.
I was in a communist prison for 11 years. We, the priests and the monks, were in prison because we wanted to continue with the religious education of young people. In the communist world, children don't belong to the parents. They belong to the state. A communist prison is a diabolic laboratory in which they wanted to transform the personality. It's not just a place of torture. They considered men like a dog, like an animal that can be trained. They put us in the hospital for mental diseases, and they gave us some shots. I don't know what kind of shots. It was a time when I saw double. I saw myself that I was speaking aloud without my knowledge. You reached a moment to keep yourself between the limit of normal and abnormal, because not everybody resists. Some persons resist up to here, another have more resistance, but one day you have to give up. When you gave up, they considered a victory. But when they asked, do you still believe in God? Yes, I still believe in God. First 6 months, sure, was very difficult. But later, not having any perspective, any horizon, any place to look out, just four walls of your cells, you have to go somewhere. And that was my conversion. I went inside. Because, you know, in the Western world, we have a so-called cosmological knowledge. We go in the outer space, outside of ourselves. Everything that we explore is outside of ourselves. But what about you? What about this inner universe that is the human personality? We call it soul in a Christian term. It's infinite like an atom. I was a theologian, I was a priest, I was a monk, and I'm ashamed to say that God, my God, was the God of the book. But God is life, His experience, His personal experience.